Hello, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for joining today. My name is Chris, and I'm the Deputy Director at the York Centre of the Stockholm Environment Institute, and also a co-investigator on the Trade Hub project. We're very happy to welcome you today to the second webinar of the Trade Hub's Trade and Nature Trade-offs and Solutions series. The purpose of this series is to identify and share case studies and present recent findings and demonstrate the impact of our work in the Trade Hub. These webinars will be being held monthly, each with a slightly different topical focus. The Trade Hub, launched in 2019, is the first research hub of its kind, bringing together over 50 organisations from 15 different countries to help make trade sustainable for people and the planet. It's funded by the UK Research Innovations Global Challenges Research Fund, or GCRF, and our researchers are exploring frontiers of transformative change within the trade, environment and development nexus. There are novel insights and empirical evidence being developed within the hub that merit sharing with a broader audience as we reach the project's midpoint, and that explains why we're undertaking these webinars. Today's webinar will discuss the following questions: how we can monitor the environmental risks and impacts of global consumption, how do we capture biodiversity and trade-linked impact assessments, and what progress have we made and what challenges remain? How does remote sensing technology help us map, measure and validate landscape impacts linked to trade, with an example using Southeast Asian rubber? And what tools are available to support supply chain decision making linked to trade and its impacts? We'll have a series of presentations and then we'll open the floor for questions and comments from the audience. Now today, via the examples that are brought up in the talks, we'll only really be scratching the surface of the broader landscape of activities that are ongoing around the methods, metrics and tools that are available to understand the impacts of trade. Indeed, one of the things that we're grappling with in the hub is that the complexity of this landscape and how we as researchers can help users make sense of this data and then apply these tools for decision making is something that's really challenging. Overcoming the implementation gap that exists between the research state of the art and its uptake in policy and practice is fundamental to our ability to respond effectively to the unwanted consequences of trade and to promote trade as a tool for sustainable development. And here we need to promote collaboration and informational alignment. So if you have your own experiences, solutions or tools that are relevant to what our speakers will be talking about today, we very much encourage you to reach out. I'd just like to quickly cover some housekeeping rules before we properly begin. So we'd like to notify you that today's session will be recorded and made available on the Trade Hub YouTube channel. Your microphone should be muted and your camera will be off during the webinar. So if you'd like to comment or ask a question, please type it in the chat function of Zoom throughout the session. If your question is to a particular speaker, please include their name in your question. And I'll then get back to these questions in the Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. If you have any technical issues, please send a direct message to our technical support, who is Laura Mack, via the chat function. And finally, I'd now like to introduce our first speaker, Maddie Harris. So Maddie is an ecosystem analyst at the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, the JNCC, which is the public body that advises the UK government and its devolved administrations on UK-wide and international nature conservation. Her work focuses on developing the evidence for the JNCC's advice on the links between biodiversity, natural capital and consumption. And this has included working on the development of an indicator of the overseas environmental impacts of the UK and of the production of JNCC's Linking Environment to Trade Guide. She'll be talking about this work now in her presentation, which is titled Understanding the Global Environmental Impacts of UK Consumption. Maddie, over to you, please.
Thanks, Chris. As Chris has mentioned, I'm going to be telling you today about our recent work toward developing an indicator framework of global environmental impacts of UK consumption. The project was jointly undertaken by ourselves at JNCC, an arm's length public body, and the Stockholm Environment Institute at the University of York. It was funded and commissioned by DEFRA, with additional support given towards the associated dashboard by the Trade Hub and Trace. The key driver for the work was the 25-year environment plan, which is the government strategy for England that sets out what we'll do to improve the environment within a generation. This includes an aim to avoid improving our domestic environment at the expense of the environment globally, highlighting that however good our domestic policies are, if we simply export our problems elsewhere, it makes little difference overall. It also has an associated indicator framework, which called for an indicator to measure against the same. However, interest in this area is rising up policy agendas much more widely as well. Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland have also published strategies that include wording such as sustainable international footprints and living within environmental limits. Internationally, zero drafts of the Convention on Biological Diversity's post-2020 framework and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals have highlighted this issue too. So the problem we're trying to solve is that as the UK, we consume a lot from overseas and we don't have a very good idea of where it comes from and what it's doing to the environment there. For example, for food products, we import about half of what we consume. And that's only part of the picture, because one of the big problems with understanding this area is that throughout the supply chain, commodities are processed into products. So whilst tracing the apple you eat back to where it was grown might be relatively straightforward, tracing the palm oil, which is one of many ingredients within your cosmetics product, back to where that was grown, adds a whole other level of complexity. So the vision for the project was to create something that could tell us, for a range of different impact metrics, deforestation, biodiversity, water stress, etc., what the UK's total impact is, including the impact from commodities embedded within more complex products, and to be able to break that down by the amount of impact taking place in each country of the world and related to each commodity that we consume. This opens up a wide range of potential use cases around identifying the commodities and countries for which action would make the most difference, including potential use cases such as trade agreements, which would be a similar process to what the European Commission currently use, or even things like directing official development assistance. So if this is such an important issue, why hasn't it been done before? Well, it's a very complex area with lots of challenges. Trade data is only publicly available directly between two countries, which misses cases where a commodity is re-exported through intermediate countries, or as I mentioned earlier, cases where it becomes embedded into another product, either directly as an ingredient or indirectly, such as beef cows eating animal feed. In this project, we've used modelling to address this issue, but that does mean that it's just an estimate, not tracing actual trade flows. Many different factors are affected by production systems, deforestation, biodiversity, but also soil degradation, human rights, etc., some of which we simply don't have global data layers for. In many of the countries where commodities are driving impacts, the UK is a small proportion of the total demand. If the UK switches its demand to source from somewhere sustainable, how can it ensure another country won't take its place consuming from the unsustainable source? It's important to show international leadership and work towards multilateral agreements, but is a challenging context within which to drive action. And all of this is set against an even more challenging context where global consumption is increasing and is predicted to continue to increase substantially. Any monitoring and solutions developed will need to take this into account. How can we produce more efficiently or reduce unsustainable consumption overall? Despite all these challenges, we've managed to put together an experimental statistic, which is a statistic published by government that's still undergoing further developments and consultation. This has been a multi-year process, starting with some work in 2019, when our contractors Route 2 completed a proof of concept study. This work was internationally peer-reviewed, and the conclusions from this were that the approach taken in the proof of concept was the best current option to take forwards, with some tweaks to improve resolution. We then set out a roadmap for indicator development. This year, with our contractors SEI, we created a data set that could be used as an experimental statistic and worked with stakeholders across government, NGOs, and industry to tailor it to their needs. I'm excited to say that this will be released next Thursday, the 28th of October 2021, alongside an associated dashboard that will let you explore the data interactively. Unfortunately, as the data is not yet published, I can't share that with you today, but I can share some of our interim results that were published back in the spring to give you an idea of how it will look. The graph on the left shows the total cropland area harvested to produce commodities that were eventually consumed in the UK. And the graph on the right estimates the hectares of tropical deforestation for which UK consumption was responsible. As you can see, it appears that over time there's a decrease in both graphs, but the numbers remain high, so there's still work to do. As I mentioned on the challenges slide, this is only a success from a holistic perspective if other countries show similarly decreasing trends. As well as land use and tropical deforestation, there'll be estimates for biodiversity loss, scarcity-weighted water use, greenhouse gas emissions from this deforestation, and a range of other metrics. There will also be an interactive dashboard published at www.commodityfootprints.earth. This screenshot, again based on the interim results, shows results for tropical deforestation associated with UK consumption, broken down by the countries in which the impacts are taking place. Results cover every production country for which there's underlying data. From a consumption country perspective, there's also more data than just the UK. You can select one of 44 other countries or 5 rest of world regions. You're also able to select a commodity that you're interested in to view the breakdown of impacts by commodity. All metrics include all crop commodities as recorded by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and some metrics also include cattle and timber. In the future, we hope to be able to continue to develop the indicator, funding dependent, to add more different types of commodities, particularly interested in trying to include those from the metals and mining sector, and more impact metric types. We also think that the indicator itself is only the tip of the iceberg. Getting a whole economy picture at a global scale will not tell you the full story, and other metrics will be needed to fully understand the problem. Once you've used the indicator to identify a commodity or area of interest, you could then develop more detailed and specific indicators that focus in on the problem areas and that are more able to measure against specific actions. 250 such tools and initiatives are explored in the Linking Environment to Trade Guide, which is aimed to introduce people to the subject area. And new tools are being released all the time. Whilst I don't think that consumption-based impacts are a problem that we'll ever understand completely, the more tools we have and the more that they align with each other, the better we can understand the problem, and so the more action we can take.
Thank you very much, Maddie. So just as a reminder, if you have questions for any of our speakers, please do type those in the chat function and don't be shy. And we'll come back to those at the end of our talks. Next up, we have Jonathan Green. John is a research fellow in the Sustainable Consumption and Production team at the Stockholm Environment Institute York Centre. He has a background in conservation science and over 10 years of experience in understanding the costs and benefits of biodiversity conservation and accounting for biodiversity and natural capital impacts. At SEI York, he undertakes work linking the impacts of trade to biodiversity loss via often complex supply chains and trade flows in agricultural commodities. The title of his talk, therefore, is not surprisingly linking trade to biodiversity. Over to you, John.
Great, thank you for that introduction and for all being here today. So, as Chris said, I'm Jonathan Green. I work at the Stockholm Environment Institute, and I will also touch on some of the work we've been doing with Maddie and colleagues. I'll mention that today. So, getting a handle on global commodity supply chains is a huge challenge because of their enormity and their complexity. And I can recommend going to this website here where you can, if you hit play, you can watch the shipping traffic over the course of a year or so, and it's mind-blowing. And it really brings home the need to have tools to understand the challenges at scale. So in order to do this and to begin to devise solutions, we really need to know what the impacts are, where they're happening, who is involved, and what drives them. Now, Maddie already mentioned the point about different scales of decision making, and depending on the context will determine what resolution data are needed. But hopefully it will be clear that multiple perspectives are useful and they're complementary to engage with stakeholders at different scales. Now, I'll briefly introduce 2 tools that we use to model agricultural commodity supply chains and their impacts before then talking about applications to biodiversity. First of all, I want to talk about Trace. Now, you can go online to find data here on the production and trade of a selection of some of the greatest deforestation risk commodities. Now, these data are freely and publicly available, and this is an example of what you can derive from that platform. So here, I've selected a country and year of interest. In this case, I've got the imports of soy from Brazil to France in 2018. And I've highlighted 4 of the biggest exporters here. And you can see that what this provides on the left-hand side on that map is insight into municipalities of production. And then in the Sankey diagram in the middle, the colored bits, That shows you the exporters, the importing countries, where stuff's being exported from, the ports, and also the country of import. And the starting point for this kind of modeling is from customs declarations and shipping manifests, which allow us to model the flow of physical commodities at high levels of spatial specificity. And these make transparent the links between locations and actors. And it's fantastic for identifying actors in the supply chain and understanding risks at a high resolution. So do take a look at the website where you can find out more about what we do and about some of the underpinning methods to do that. We also complement that trace approach with a full consumption-based approach. And here I will talk about the dashboard and the model that underpins that that Maddie mentioned. So this is fresh out of the box. This link won't work until the 28th, as Maddie said. But here we're linking multi-regional input-output models. These are global models of economic flows. And we're linking those to information on the physical production of commodity crops in a so-called hybridized model, because we hybridize financial data with physical production data. And we can then link these to biodiversity extensions to understand what our consumption or our trade impact risk is. Now, why do we bother with two models? Sorry, that's the visual that you can get from the dashboard. So why do we bother with two models? It is because of our ability to both understand the global picture as well as to take deeper dives on particular deforestation risk commodities. Now, with the latter, we can follow flows through actors to give a high level of transparency around who, where, and when, which simply isn't possible across every commodity and country context. Now, these models can be run independently, but we've also begun prototyping the linking of trace and iota, and this is an upcoming priority for us in the coming months or so to do more extensive integration. And this will bring these together for a kind of cross-scalar perspectives on particular deforestation risk commodities. But taken together, these give us insight into where the pressure arises from, i.e. the demand, where it's felt in the production landscape, the actors involved from municipal government and producers through traders, port authorities, import countries, all the way through to consuming sectors and countries. Now we can and have linked both these model types to tropical deforestation metrics. Now, tropical forests harbour much of the world's biodiversity, as well as a host of other services and benefits. But deforestation in one place carries different biodiversity risks to another. And what about areas outside of tropical forests? Therefore, there is a question about can we and should we try to get at the biodiversity impacts more specifically? So I want to move on to talk a little bit more specifically now about biodiversity. So biodiversity is immediately probably intuitive as a concept. Often we're thinking in the form of particular biodiverse ecosystems such as coral reefs, chalk grasslands, tropical forests, or some other ecosystem. But representing biodiversity in footprinting tools is tricky. We can think about biodiversity in all sorts of ways. And I pulled this diagram that was put together by Stuart Pym for the Encyclopedia Britannica, because I think it really helps to highlight this. So within a particular site of interest, for example, we might want to think in terms of ecosystems, the number that are impacted, or perhaps just those ecosystems that are not found in other places. Perhaps that's more important. Alternatively, we might zoom in a level and think about the species, also quite an intuitive metric for biodiversity. We could estimate or calculate the number of species within a region. Or again, we might want to focus on just those species that are unique to the area, or just those that are threatened for their continued persistence. Or perhaps we want to zoom in even closer and start to think about the underpinnings of all of this, which is the genes. Should we be more concerned about those genetic lineages which are more evolutionarily distinct? And there are many more variations on this too, such as the choice can actually be overwhelming for decision makers and unclear as to what difference it makes anyway. And of course, biodiversity is enormously complex, so it isn't just those components of biodiversity that we can describe, but also their interactions and the ecological processes that sustain them. So inevitably then the question becomes not so much one of how do I measure biodiversity or an impact on diversity, but rather what's the best proxy that I can use to measure biodiversity? Our ability to map, measure and translate the complexity inevitably trades off with other important factors. Chiefly accessibility, who's able to access the data? Do they need specialist skills or tools? Tangibility, does that thing that you're measuring and reporting on chime with something that an average user can understand? The cost, how much does it cost to create or use the data? This also has a bearing on how often they'll be updated and therefore the ability to show on the ground impact. And replicability. How easy is it to replicate a metric for a different region, for a different time, or for a more complete taxonomic coverage? Data availability is often the limiting factor, as well as technical capacity needs, and metrics are heavily skewed towards better known groups and piloted in places with better input data. So we have, however, made some significant progress. And on the left here is a method based on the species area relationship developed by Abhishek Chowdhury and colleagues, which is frequently employed in life cycle assessments. In this, characterization factors are used to assign the impact of a particular commodity crop to the biodiversity of an ecoregion. And as shown in the figures, it can serve to highlight the role of global trade and the concentration of risk according to consumers or producer countries. We've implemented this in the UK experimental indicator described by Maddie, and we're now exploring what complementary metrics we can use alongside it. On the right are a couple of figures from a study in which we dive deeper into a subnational supply chain, in soy in Brazil in this case, to try and understand better the who, the what, and the where at fine spatial and taxonomic scales. So in this, we used information on species historical and current ranges to assess the threat that soy expansion poses to their continued persistence. And I want to finish just by sharing some thoughts on some of the major challenges and questions that I think are important to address. So first, does a more complex biodiversity metric allow better decisions to be made further down a supply chain? For example, is it enough just to understand the tropical deforestation impacts, or even just the impacts on charismatic species like tuna or orangutans? We want to look at this by conducting a comparison of biodiversity indicator metrics at a commodity level to understand the nuances between them, which is not so much to advocate for one or another or identify a best one, but to understand what each of them reflects, to understand their overlap and their complementarity. And ultimately, we want to try pushing those metrics through a supply chain model to see how the spatial variation on the ground plays out in terms of the information provided to downstream decision makers. Second, is around indirect and diffuse impacts, such as pollution, landscape effects, and edge effects. Now, we know that land use change is important, and hence that's our focus, but we also know that habitat intactness is also important, both because of increased anthropogenic pressures in less intact ecosystems, but also because of sensitivity of species to disturbance and the potential impacts on ecological processes, such as migrations and interactions between species or populations. And third is responsiveness, both in terms of the indicator being responsive to different commodity production systems, for example, intensive versus extensive rearing of livestock, and in terms of mitigation measures that producers might take. And in all of this, it's vital to consider how the resolution, the quality, the regularity and availability of data might impact on the ability or speed of these metrics to respond to on-the-ground changes, i.e. potential weak links in biodiversity footprinting. In fact, our changes in biodiversity footprints are currently likely to be more down to changes in our models of trade than to changes in the current state of biodiversity. One of the biggest gaps here is the ability to produce annual global maps of commodity production and expansion. And these maps are where our trade models interact with our land-based impact models. And so I'm especially pleased that I'm going to be handing over to Yungsha next to hear about the really novel and exciting work she's doing around mapping of one of those commodity crops, rubber in Southeast Asia. Back to you.
Thank you very much, John. And great introduction as well for the next talk, which is from Yungsha Wang. So Yungsha is a postdoctoral researcher at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh, and she's mapping rubber plantations and land cover change in Southeast Asia. She's interested in large-scale land use and land cover change, mapping forest disturbances, forest carbon dynamics, and other remote sensing applications. She has over 5 years' experience in processing and analysing satellite remote sensing imagery using Google Earth Engine, and the title of her talk today is Using Remote Sensing and Crowdsourcing to Monitor Rubber Expansion in Southeast Asia. Thank you. Yungsha, it's over to you.
Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to give a talk on using remote sensing and crowdsourcing to monitor the rubber expansion in Southeast Asia. And hopefully this will be also very useful for the other commodity mapping. My talk will answer the following questions today. What are the challenges to monitor rubber expansion, and how can we use recent remote sensing technology to overcome these challenges? First, the rubber expansion. As you may know that the natural rubber is used in many products, notably in the car tires. Rubber is mainly produced in Southeast Asia, and from 1990 to 2010, the price of rubber skyrocketed to the unprecedented highs, and the global production of rubber also more than doubled. Rubber has a potential to benefit the livelihoods and contribute to climate change mitigation. However, rubber is often planted at the expense of natural forest cover, where the slash and burn is a very common way that to deforest the forest cover, then plant rubber, and which will result in a huge biodiversity loss and contribute to the global warming. So far, there is still no universal certification scheme on the rubber, and there's little consumer awareness of deforestation linked to rubber. So it's very critical to understand the large-scale extent of rubber and area of deforestation linked to rubber. Here's a list of few challenges that to monitor the rubber: the lack of large-scale rubber distribution map, and there's no accurate information on the area of deforestation linked to rubber. In terms of the remote sensing data, that the resolution and frequency of remote sensing data, as well as the data storage and the computation limitation. So today I'm gonna talk about Google Earth Engine and Collect Earth Online, these two tools that could potentially overcome those challenges. So what is remote sensing? Remote sensing is the process of detecting and monitoring the Earth's surface at a distance. Typically it's from satellite or the aircraft. For example, here in the satellite, it carries special cameras and sensors that emitted the radiation from different wavelength. Here is called different bands here. On the Earth, for the different objects on the Earth, and the reflections of those radiation varies. So based on those variations, then we can detect the different subject, different land covers on the Earth. And by using those different, so here's a list of remote sensing data, including Landsat, Sentinel, and some climate and weather data. Today, I'm going to talk about Sentinel-2, which we're going to use to map the rubber expansion, and the Landsat, which go back to 1990s, that we could use to track the historical deforestation date of the rubber. Yeah, and the analyzed tools, the Google Earth Engine. Google Earth Engine, it integrates data and cloud computation and data analyze APIs and Earth Engine apps, which could make huge impact on the Earth observation research. So it has the free access to over 3 million gigabytes of remote sensing data, which you don't need to download, and you can just analyze them on the cloud using very fast Google scale computation. And here is the the Google Engine web interface, where in the middle here you can write your script to analyze all the remote sensing data, and on the left you can save your script, and here you can print any of data set and visualize. Here at the bottom, you can visualize any remote sensing data. Here, just example of the Sentinel-2 RGB imagery is a combination of three different bands as a red, green, and blue, and RGB imagery. On the left here is composite from January to February. On the right here is March, April composite imagery of Sentinel-2. As you can see here on the left of this river, like it shows looks like a background in the left image, but looks green on the right imagery. This is phenology information of the rubber, where in January and February, that rubber leaf fell, but since beginning of March and April, then when the rubber leaves regrew back again, and it shows this greenness from the satellite imagery. And we zoom into a small area, and this very, very high imagery, you can see that it's clearly that's a rubber plantation there. So we use this normalized difference between this rubber leaf fall and growth stages, and train the random forest machine learning classification to map the rubber. Of course, to run the machine learning, we will need the ground truth points to train the classification. Here we have over 800 forest samples and 600 rubber points. We know, that is rubber or forest on the ground. And we randomly split those points into 80%, which train the machine learning classification, and using the remaining 20% that to validate the classification map. Then for the deforestation date, we use the time series Landsat imagery from 1990s until 2020. There's over 30 years of annual Landsat imagery, and use this train the spectral-temporal segmentation algorithm, where here it shows this, like for each pixel, there's this time series over 30 years. And for this algorithm, it finds different vertex of this time series, then fits into the linear regression, which is called segments in here. And the deforestation date for that pixel will be the lowest point here. So yeah, here is the rubber map that we created. The overall produced accuracy for rubber is about 93%, which is very good. And on the right here shows the map, and on the left here we plotted the area of deforestation linked to the rubber since 1990s until 2022. And for different countries, as you can tell that for Thailand, yes, most rubber located in the Thailand. And you can see the area of deforestation of those high increase of deforestation and decrease of the deforestation. And this matches for each country follows similar trend, which, if you recall, the rubber price, which skyrocketed in 2010, 2011, these 2 years, and there's a peak of deforestation in those years as well. So yeah, but now we would like to extend our rubber map into the outside of this mainland Southeast Asia, which extend to Malaysia and Indonesia area, but we need more ground truth points to train our classification. So in the previous study that they have, there are study that who did that showed the made the rubber map, but it's around 2010, where they have over 3,000 points of forest across the entire Southeast Asia, and over 2,500 points of rubber here. You can see that the dark color shows where is collected from the field survey, where they visit the sites and know, oh, that's exactly rubber or forest in that area. But the majority points is collected by the Google Earth, where some experts identify those each individual points by the eye using the very high resolution imagery. But those points are from the around 2010, and we need to relabel all the points again for 2021. That's because within these 10 years, probably lots of rubber has been converted to the other land uses, or the forest is not forest anymore. So the use for the visual interpretation of those points, we will use Collect Earth Online. And it's also a cloud platform here, but it allows you to identify each points, collect and validate those each points classifications. It allows multiple people to work together. And also you can random sample points and design your own survey on this Collect Earth Online. And in Collect Earth Online, it has very high resolution imagery available. Here you can see here a list of very high resolution imagery that you can choose. In the recent years, there's more, but yeah. But also you can also link all the remote sensing data from Google Earth Engine to Collect Earth Online here, and which is called to dashboard that you can include. Yeah, this process that is to improve our machine learning classification. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Happy to answer any questions.
Yes, thank you. Yes, and please do put your questions in the chat and we can come back to those at the end. So last but not least, we have Julia Wentworth. And Julia is a member of the World Conservation Monitoring Centre's Science Programme and is Project Officer for the Trade Development Environment Hub, Trade Hub, as well as the GCRF Development Corridors Partnership. And more broadly, she provides project coordination and technical support on both impact and research-oriented projects at WCMC. So she will be today introducing a new Trade Hub platform, which brings together a number of tools, hopefully useful for monitoring the environmental and social impacts of trade. So the title of her talk is the Trade Tools Navigator. Over to you, Julia.
Hi, thank you, Chris. So today I'm going to introduce and demo for you the new output by the Trade Hub, which is the Trade Tools Navigator. So initially we identified that, of course, there are many drivers of biodiversity loss, which would include land use change, direct exploitation of mammals, animals, plants, and pollution. And these are all strongly linked to the production of commodities. And although there are tools and data available to explain and navigate and respond to these impacts of consumption, finding the right tool to help understand these impacts and activities on biodiversity through, say, complex supply chains can be quite a challenge. And there is no other platform or no platform which brings together all of these tools in one place in order to help users understand the impacts of production and consumption on biodiversity. So therefore, we came up with a solution called the Trade Tools Navigator. So the Trade Tools Navigator seeks to bring together all of these tools identified in one place in order to help users understand the impacts of production and consumption of nature. So the aim of the tool is to add value to existing work and synthesize what tools are currently available in the trade sphere. Effectively, we've created a catalog of information of tools, and this makes finding these tools more efficient, as well as having availability in a single place. How we went about doing this in 2019, when the Trade Hub started, we did a scoping study, and this was a basic sort of Google search. And what we did was identify online platforms, tools, websites, and other digital assets that are available to access trade data, track, and look at the impacts of trade. So that was looking at cataloging initiatives, measures, models, data providers, platforms, as well as certifications. So this resulted in over 450 tools and initiatives, which we kept quite crudely in a spreadsheet. And so what we decided to do is use this create an online platform, and which would be able to give us information on sort of the overview of the state of trade, and look at the state of nature, and we also have a look at impacts, direct and indirect, especially looking at negative impacts. And so that would also include value supply chains, actors, commodities, locations, etc. Then we'd have drivers of impact and spatialized information, so land use, places most at risk, scales of impact, map or list trade flows, and also have a look at solutions, so the latest information or the latest research, laws, policies, regulation, and certifications. In practice, we'd hope that the tool would be useful for academia as well as governmental advisors. So business involved in commodity trade or production, especially moving towards solutions. And of course, as I mentioned previously, to make sort of research more efficient and have an availability of information in a single place. So previously mentioned, the JNCC published a guide called the LET Guide, and that was looking at measuring the impacts of trade in the environment. Other areas which we would hope people would be able to explore is looking at what the biggest challenge is looking at the linkages of different information in order to inform decision making. So this is a quote that we got from our user research. So we have all the tools and information available to us, but we're lacking the linkage. So we're hoping that the Navigator will be able to help inform these types of decisions. So using the filtering function within the Navigator, you should be able to identify which tools are available to support work. So for example, you're able to see which tools are relevant for a chosen commodity, which tools are available for a particular country, what certifications are available for, say, agriculture production, what are my upstream commodities being produced and or sourced from. So the next steps for the Trade Tool Navigator is that we are hoping to launch by the end of October. We are currently adding further details to the tools criteria, and we are extending our feedback request to gather more responses from private sector as well as government perspective. So we need to understand what information is wanted from them, what challenges they may face. And then we are having a phase 2 rollout, which is at the end of 2021. So we are including a glossary of terms. We're going to improve our filtering as well as add any additional tools that may not be listed. So now I'm going to demo the tool for you. Right, so the tool is easily accessed through the GCRF TRADE Hub website. And as you can see, there is a landing page. At the top, we have all the filtering tools. So the filtering of typology, keywords, spatial scale, intended users, as well as a legend, which informs what typology is. Then we have the list over here, which would pull up the name of the resource, and then of course the URL, the lead organization, typology, and any keywords associated with the resource. If you click on the forward button, that will bring up a pop-up, which should possibly give you more information, such as the description, countries that may be involved, spatial scale, updated frequency, and any other information that may be relevant. So it's quite a simple, neat tool in that. So say if we want to choose a typology, so for instance, choose data platform, have a look at some keywords. Let's go with coffee. And look on a spatial scale, we can have a look at, say, global and national, and hit apply, and that should bring up entries that are relevant to what you've filtered out, which is quite neat, as well as we'll show you any other typology. So if you wanted to download this information, all you had to do is select download in the CSV. The CSV will download, simple Excel, and here you'll just get the Excel information that you downloaded. So that would also include the description of the resource, the URL, who the lead organization is, and if any partners, typology, keywords, and so forth. So that is effectively how the tool works. It's simple and neat. And again, you can filter out for many things, many keywords. Again, I think to be more specific, what we've used is any sort of commodities which are related to the Trade Hub, as well as partner countries which are related to the Trade Hub. So partner countries such as Tanzania, the Republic of Congo, China, Central African Republic, as well as on a global scale. Then commodities that we've mostly focused on within the tool is the commodities which are found within the Trade Hub: palm oil, wildlife, agriculture, soya, etc. And that's the tool. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. And thanks also to all of our speakers today. I think you've done an excellent job of representing both some of the solutions available to try and make sense of the complexity around trade and biodiversity impacts and other associated impacts, but also some of the challenges involved in this work as well. So I'm going to move to questions now. We've got about 8 minutes, I'm going to say, to run through some questions. Probably not time to have all of them, but I'm going to start with a question for Maddie, please. And that was around the downward trend in deforestation impacts that has been observed in the UK indicator results. So is there an explanation, for that downward trend, or possible hypotheses linked to that?
So I think we'd need to do some further analyses to identify exact causes behind the data. The factors that affect the model from a generic perspective are the amount the UK is consuming, so the total biomass of each commodity. If we consume less overall, you'd expect to see less impact. The types of commodity we're consuming. If we were shifting our consumption from high impact commodities to low impact commodities, based on the underlying data, you'd expect to see a change. The countries from which we're consuming. If we're consuming from locations with high deforestation rates, linked to the types of commodities we're consuming, you'd expect to see a change. And if there are changes in production practices on the ground that affect the national average impact for each country we're importing from, you'd also expect to see a change. So it was out of scope for the current phase of work to unpick the exact causes and how much each of these factors are contributing to changes in the model, but we hope to do a bit more digging into this kind of question in future work if funded.
Thanks, Maddie. And maybe just a quick follow-up question while you're here. Could you just comment a little bit more on what the indicators in some may say about the sustainability of the UK supply chain? So I think this question is getting at, where these indicators sit on the sort of pressures to impact pathway of monitoring impacts, but also whether, how do we make sense of this information in some to inform the sustainability of the UK?
Yeah, I think the question here is around what we mean by sustainable. I think in the question it was talking about measuring natural resource use, which these go a step further than doing. We do have one indicator looking at total biomass that is focused on natural resource use, but most of the indicators are extensions that are looking at pressures or impacts, deforestation caused by the natural resource use, biodiversity loss estimated to be caused by the natural resource use, etc. So it goes a steps closer to saying something about sustainability. But if the question was talking about kind of how much counts as sustainable, and we haven't gone as far as that, putting a line on the graph saying this is sustainable and this is not. We've just reported the figures as they are. Yeah, so that's.
Great, thank you, Maddie. So moving on to a question for John now. There's a question from Matt here about there being a high number of small or undiscernible points of origin in the trace diagram that you illustrated in your talk. He was wondering whether that's an information gap, and if not, has that work revealed much about the role of smaller enterprises, micro or small enterprises in the global supply chains of key commodities, and how those then link to the larger commercial operations supply into the UK?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really interesting question, and one to which I'm not going to be able to provide all of the answers. But I thought it might be useful to kind of describe how we get to what I was showing, and that is that in the data that we start from is the export data, and we have actually a lot of confidence in those because those data are the kind of data from where government get their tax records and therefore some of their revenue. So actually they are pretty good. And they do have lots of, there are lots of small companies within those records as well. And many of those companies will have operations within the countries that they're exporting from. So in terms of, is there a data gap at our starting point, which is the exporting companies? Not especially, and I don't think that is skewed towards the smaller companies at least. But in terms of what's going on within the landscape, that is a significant kind of body of work, I guess, and that's the reason that we don't do this for every commodity at every country context. Is that we're actually having to we're having to gather data within the country on some of the operations that are happening. So this is like processing facilities. In the case of soy, which I was showing, that includes some crushing facilities and silos, and each of those were then using methods to try and map those against the companies that are exporting. And then into what I was actually showing as well was then also linked through to the biodiversity impact. And so kind of there is a potential for a bit of a data gap there. There is definitely geographic and taxonomic bias in our understanding of biodiversity in the landscape. So for sure there could be a bit of an information gap there. But I was also zoomed in only to a particular kind of supply chain, a particular flow, if you like, and that was in a single year. I think it was 2017 or 18, and looking from Brazil to France, and for one commodity, soy. So that's another reason that actually it was just highlighting particular areas on that.
Thank you, John. So moving now to Yunxia, got a question linked explicitly to the biodiversity side of things rather than deforestation. So maybe you could comment on how you might link biodiversity information into the work that you've been doing on land use change and deforestation. Is it going to be possible to do that via the work that you're doing?
Hi, Chris. Yeah, I think that's definitely possible. Yeah, so now so far I've been produced, as I show, that there's the distribution of rubber linked to previous deforestation in the mainland Southeast Asia. But yeah, now I'm planning to expand it to Indonesia, and Malaysia. But yeah, if we have the biodiversity loss data, which is supposed to be the spatial distribution map data, then we can very easily to overlay those layers and try to calculate the how much like the effect of the biodiversity loss due to rubber expansion.
Great, thank you, Ngsha. I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to have one question for Julia, and then maybe pose a question to all of you just to finish us off. Julia, in terms of the balance of more of the risk mapping tools that you're identifying in the Tool Navigator versus those that are looking at more solutions oriented, so informing what supply chain access particularly should do about the problems, what does the balance look like across the tools that have been identified?
I'm not too sure of what the balance is, but the list is not exhaustive. And we do ask people, so within the tool itself at the bottom, we have asked people if something is not listed to get in contact with us to let us know. So it is just key to note that any of the tools that are mentioned within the Navigator focus primarily on what the Trade Hub has focused on in terms of location, as well as commodities. So those are our sort of key areas in which we sort of looked at. However, we're always happy to look into that and add more of those types of tools if there is a need for that. So we're still looking at ways to improve it. So that would definitely be a way to improve, to sort of add those types of tools or more of those types of tools if it is required by users.
Great, thank you, Julia. So I'm going to ask one more question, but I'm going to ask the speakers to respond in the chat just while I close the session today. So my final question was going to be thinking about the topic of your presentation in particular. If you could focus if you had a pot of money and could focus on one particular research challenge linked to what you've been talking about, where would you focus this going forward? If you could respond in the chat. Think about that while I'm speaking, respond in the chat, that would be great. But otherwise, thank you to all of our speakers today, John, Maddie, Julia and Yungsha, and to all of you in the audience for listening and for asking your questions. The next webinar in this series is Trade, Biodiversity and Climate Change, and that will be held on Tuesday the 23rd of November between 12 and 1 p.m. GMT. And the registration link for that should be posted in the chat in a second. The recording of today's webinar will be available on the Trade Hub YouTube channel. And if you wish to stay updated about the Trade Hub project, please do visit our website or follow us on social media or reach out via email or whatever you want to do. But please do get in touch. Thank you all for your attendance today. And I wish you a very nice day, afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. Thank you, everybody.